And I also find that the more relaxed and the more broad your world is, I think you become a better doctor because you become a better human being. So you can interact with your patients better, you enjoy your patients more, you can interact with your team more. And certainly, and people talk about surgeons, but surgery is the ultimate team sport. I can't do what I do without the 8 people in the room and the people on the ward and intensive care and my fabulous secretaries and all the different people that make so that we can do safe surgery. So that's number one, is you've got to make sure that you hang on to your clinical stuff and do it properly. And then ultimately you need help because you can't do it on your own. So you need to build a team and you need to be loyal to that team. Loyalty goes downwards, not upwards.
Today's guest is Professor Michael Vallely, a leading Australian cardiothoracic surgeon, clinical professor, and a true trailblazer in medtech innovation. Michael is renowned for his minimally invasive heart and lung surgery, his care for elderly and high-risk patients, and for performing over 1,000 open heart surgeries. Every year, he implants more than 250 life-saving devices, like pacemakers and defibrillators. He's also built an incredible portfolio career, including co-founding Cordis Asset Management Company, where he's helping shape the future of medtech investment and innovation in Australia. But what really sets Michael apart and why I'm so excited to have him on the MedTech Mentor podcast today is the depth and breadth of his interests and the energy he brings to every conversation. Over the past year, I've had the pleasure of spending a bit of time with Michael, and our chats have been wild and wonderful. We chat about everything from creativity, medicine, and my most favorite of all, the philosophical chats about resilience in life. Michael's personal journey is a triumph and a testament to resilience, but also to creativity and what's possible when clinicians imagine careers beyond the boundaries of traditional practice. Today, we hope to share some of his stories and insights with you and to inspire anyone who's dreaming of a diverse, dynamic path in medicine to take that leap. Thank you so much today for joining me, Michael. We're really lucky to have you on the show.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's nice to be with you.
I told you I was going to embarrass you a little bit.
Thank you.
You have to give everybody some context, and just like any journey, we start from the beginning, and I guess without going too far back, we just want to understand sort of what drew you to medicine, what drew you to cardiac thoracic surgery.
That's a good question. I grew up on a sheep and wheat farm outside of Cootamundra, and I initially wanted to be a veterinarian, as you would say in the American sense. And then I realized I probably like people more than I dislike animals, but I like people more than animals. And so I actually went to uni to be a country general surgeon. I had a couple of local doctors who were mentors. One was a GP anaesthetist and one was an FRACS surgeon. And so I went to uni to do that. I don't think I knew back in the late 80s when I started university, I don't think I knew what cardiac surgery was. Everyone knew of Victor Chang, but I, to be honest with you, was not something I even really thought about. I had a real interest in vascular surgery. I thought that was really interesting, but my interest predated a lot of the endovascular stuff, and I really liked intensive care. So it was a natural marrying of things, but it was a serendipitous decision I made one afternoon that I didn't actually really think about when I was in the emergency department, just chatting to someone who said, "Oh, well, I want to be chest surgeon." So that sounds interesting. I never really thought about it again for a considerable number of years. So sometimes you make decisions when you're 23 years old that don't actually kind of at the time seemed to make sense, but in retrospect were kind of a little bit nonsensical. So off I went. I ended up at I was at Westmead as an intern, but I ended up back at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, where I'd spent my time at the University of Sydney. So that was sort of home for me. I'd been on campus. I lived at Wesley College for the bulk of my medical degree, which is an undergraduate degree at the time. And one thing led to another, and I sort of scaled reasonably easily through the general surgical ranks. And then ultimately I decided that I wanted to do a PhD. And that was a very fledgling opportunity. Getting a scholarship was alarmingly easy because nobody wanted to do it. And I got a very interesting project, which was looking at the inflammatory response to the heart-lung machine. At the time, beating heart surgery would come in. So I ended up doing a PhD looking at on-pump surgery with the pump heart-lung machine versus off-pump surgery with without the heart-lung machine. And that was really interesting. That was a very successful PhD. I did lots of pretty interesting work, and that sent me on a pathway with meeting interesting people. And then over the time, I ended up at North Shore, and I learnt beating heart surgery at North Shore with a couple of very pioneering Australian surgeons, John Brereton and Don Ross. And then I ended up overseas with a fellowship with John Pepper at the Brompton, who was an amazing academic surgeon of some note. And he was also just a very genuine, kind man. And I really just enjoyed working with him. And I met some really interesting people in London. Came back to a job at Royal Prince Alfred for about a decade and built, which I'm very proud of. I had a fantastic clinical research program I really like looking after junior guys and girls. And we built a really interesting clinical research program where I supervised PhDs and masters and honours programs. And we published a lot of papers, which I was really happy to do. And then one thing led to another, and I ended up leaving Prince Alfred nearly a decade ago now, and then probably scratched itches that I'd been searching for. So I ended up working for a consulting firm for a year, doing some private practice. I started the Northern Beaches Cardiothoracic unit, and then I got recruited to Ohio State universities in the United States, and they wanted someone to start their off-pump coronary program, and also to sort of bring some senior leadership to their structural heart program. And for better or worse, I'd done a lot of structural heart over the years. I jumped on the structural heart bandwagon, for want of a better word, in 2009, which is a very long time ago, sort of 16 years ago. And we built a multidisciplinary heart team at Prince Alfred and Macquarie University Hospital. And I took that kind of spirit with me to the States, and that was really useful. And then I got recruited from Ohio State University to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York to do the same sort of thing. But then for personal reasons, I needed to come back to Sydney. My wife was unwell, so we needed to come back to Australia. So I came back to Australia, and I'm now back working here, which I'm really enjoying. I'm back at Macquarie University Hospital, which is the busiest structural heart program in the country. It's a very nice campus, and I do a couple of days a week in the public sector at St George Hospital, which I really enjoy. And in that parallel period, I really like doing other things, meeting interesting people. Hence, you and I connected over LinkedIn. And so I did a lot of work with various device companies over the years, some advisory board work. And I also had the privilege to work with Boston Consulting Group, and I also worked for McKinsey's in New York for a while as well, all in the side of doing these things. And ultimately, though, funds management and finance was really fascinating. So a couple of us got together. It started in the operating room, and then we built Cordis Asset Management, and that's been running real money for over 4 years now. And that's been a fascinating journey, and how to build a fund, what that looks like, how to manage real money, responsibility that goes with that. And so we've got a global medical technology fund that actually sort of is coalesces all of the companies that are listed on the World Stock Exchange that look after the products that we use on a day-to-day basis. And that's obviously a demographic play with the aging population. And then on the other side of things, a really good retired surgical friend of mine, Hugh Patterson, had an idea around preserving the ventricle for the mitral valve. And in parallel, we've built a little heart valve company, Sydney Heart Valve, which is a unique heart valve in that it preserves the left ventricle and preserves the mitral valve apparatus, and that preserves left ventricular function in patients that have got heart failure. So that's actually been a really cool thing to do as well. Once again, team building, working with nice, interesting people, and having everything going in parallel.
In your bio,
and it's
Michael.
been a good thing. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry to cut you off there. I missed you starting your own your own medical device company as well.
Company. No, that was another thing. So the device company has been a really interesting journey. It also brings to bear the need for having clinicians that are interested in building devices, because you'd have to have a need that's an unmet need that then you can actually satisfy that unmet needs. And we've got a fantastic engineer that leads our team, and we've got three surgeons in the background, and we're having some very progressive conversations with some global medtechs, and we've got a lot of surgeons around the world that are waiting for our valve, because it does solve a problem that as yet is an unmet solution. Sorry, a solution. So that's been an interesting thing. So yeah, that's me, and I've got 3 kids and a cat and a couple of rabbits, and so I've done a lot as well. So
yeah, a very, very full life and rich experiences. Now, you said someone during that journey, was it John Brompton? Is that how I say his name? That stood out to me.
John Brereton and Don Ross were very.
Yeah.
I came out the other, did a lot of different level in terms of evidence creation around doing coronary surgery on the beating heart without touching aorta for stroke prevention. But also what I really liked about working with Don and with John was that they treated you as an equal human being. And so they recognized your, intellectual capacities and your interest. And obviously you had, at the time, had youthful enthusiasm, 20 plus years ago. And so they harnessed that, and that was a great mentorship process. And then that's continued into, Don's retired and John's about to retire. But that was a really formative period for me. And that concept around the beating heart surgery is what basically was underpinned all of my interests around brain protection and operating on the elderly. And then that obviously led pretty easily, because of your global connections through a very small world that is cardiac surgery on a global level, was a very easy transition across to the United States for that nearly 3-year period, which I really enjoyed. Yeah, the American experience at sort of professorial level was extremely eye-opening and truly wonderful. It was fantastic.
Yes, you've spoken of that time so fondly, and I think it was just the way that you
Yeah.
mentioned John and Don, and said genuine kindness and that sort of leadership that they provided with you to you. And one of my questions that I wanted to ask you was, through that expansive, rich experience, who were the mentors or the people in your life that really influenced some of those changes? And potentially Don and John were one of those to lead you to specialize in
Oh, no,
this field.
definitely. I mean, I was lucky in that Paul Banham was a fledgling. He was my PhD supervisor, and he was a decade older than me. And there's all these decade older. So someone who's a decade older than me, and I've got mentees that are a decade younger. Some are 2 decades younger, and now as I'm getting older, they're nearly 3 decades younger. But I think they were very important people. The other thing too is you don't just need mentors, you need champions. You actually need someone can give you some advice, but sometimes often you just need help. So you need people who will create a space for you and bring other people in, provide funding, because obviously there's funding you have to eat. I was very, very lucky. The College of Surgeons, everything had lined up. This is nearly 30 years ago now, where I applied for a scholarship. Now you'd probably be a queue of 50 people, 100 people, and I would never have got one because I wasn't that way inclined back then. So I was very lucky. I got a scholarship, and that scholarship was extended over a 3-year period. I have a very good relationship with the general surgeons at Prince Alfred, who allowed me to go off and do what I needed to do, because I was on a general surgical training program. The things are fairly different. And then ultimately, things are laid out pretty nicely over that course of time. And then you had to just do the work, really. But I think where I flourished the most was when I had people to look after. I think it was one thing to have people looking after me, but what really got me out of bed was having a team that you're responsible for. So you're responsible for their outcomes and responsible for their theses and responsible for their. So that's the thing that's given me the most joy, I suppose, over my career is those team buildings. And I've extended that out into my other business interest, into Cordis, into the Sydney Heart Valve program. I've really enjoyed the advisory board work I've done with the APAC people, and I was on the US Senior Advisory Board for Medtronic for a few years, and that was a lot of fun, seeing the North Americans think very differently to the Europeans or the Asians, and I think that was really interesting. And then ultimately, the Cordis team has been the great eye-opener, because I'm working with MedTech Global. I mean, Donald O'Dwyer is the chair of our board, and he's probably the most accomplished MedTech executive in Australia that nobody knows about, but he launched the drug-eluting stent for the world, which is still the number one MedTech launch in history. He rolled Edwards out of Baxter some 30 odd years ago. And he's just been a fantastic mentor, both in a boardroom level, but also in how to get the best out of initially a fairly disparate group of people who don't know each other very well, and bringing us all together. So that Cordis experience has been fantastic, because finance is not something that we spend a lot of time in as doctors. You might, as you get more senior, you might operate on the odd finance person, but you don't actually interact with them very well. But I've really enjoyed that sort of 7-year process now of getting to know lots of different people, both globally and locally in that finance world, and building out this genuine asset management business. And we've been featured in the AFR. We've been featured on lots of podcasts like this, and it's really been a really good thing to do.
Yeah, 100%. Like you said, it's just something that isn't part of your day to day, and I think that's what's really going to be interesting for our listeners. There's and we'll dive into this a little bit more. Just there's so many clinicians out there that do have an interest in moving away from the traditional career pathways and being an entrepreneur, or exploring creating a device, or in your case, moving into finance. It's just a great opportunity to be able to create a portfolio career. And it certainly sounds like the time that you spent overseas and the time that you spent in your fellowship were really defining moments for you that shaped you as a surgeon, and then ultimately connected to you some of these new pathways that you're now getting an opportunity to be in day to day.
Definitely. I left the New South Wales, experience, and I needed some time away. To be honest with you, I needed to get out, and so, oh, thank you, sweetie. Just got a nice little cup of tea from Audrey.
Oh, that's so lovely.
She's
We
10.
love a tea break.
She's 10. No, she's good. It's in a little
Thank you.
nice little pink pot. So I hate to think what's in it, but anyway. So getting to North America I literally went 10,000 miles from where I was, and it was the most. And we hit with COVID, so I experienced COVID in a giant US academic center. And I also understood there's a very different mentality for doctors in the North America, which I don't think we understand. I think we've got a very Anglo-oriented medical system that's come out of the English system, and the American system has grown on its own, separate, I'm reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin at the moment. I'm yet to get to the revolutionary period, but you can see that all that Georgian stuff in America separated, the United States of America separated in 1776, whenever it was. And so there's a whole lot of things that happen in the American health system that are very, very different to the Anglo health system, which we've come from. And I really, really enjoyed seeing those differences up close in a position of leadership. I was the director of the operating theatres for the heart hospital, and I did a bunch of transformation changes, and we had to manage COVID, and we had to manage new procedures, and we had to manage a whole lot of stuff. And there's physicians' assistants in America. We don't have those in Australia. There's nurse practitioners that operate very independently. We don't have those in Australia either. So from an experience point of view, it was an incredible thing to see that health system up close. And all your preconceived ideas about American healthcare went out the window totally. And I loved working in America. It was an incredible experience. And I do think that, from an Australian point of view, we need to look to the Americans. I don't think their insurance system, possibly, but certainly the way they structure their academic hospitals and the way they remunerate people and the way they resource people to operate at the Michael Porter's value-based healthcare and concept and time-driven activity-based costing and all this sort of stuff is very, very interesting, in that you want to have people functioning at the absolute top of their game. And one problem we do have in Australia is there's no scalability of individuals. So it's you try and operate at the top of your game when you're operating, but then you spend a lot of time running around doing fairly menial things. And the junior doctors do a lot of menial things that I think could be done by mid-level providers. So that was one thing I did learn from America, is your ability to be efficient is so much higher as a senior practitioner than it is in Australia, where I work in 3 or 4 places and drive around all over the place. So that was a really eye-opening thing. And I do miss that. I miss that every day when I'm in Sydney traffic and paying tolls. So it's painful.
Well, it sounds like you mentioned there as well that, some of your most joyful experiences currently are looking after others and sharing some of these experiences that you have. And I find that really interesting. As we get older in life, we realize that the picking up that responsibility actually leads to purpose, which leads to fulfillment, which makes us feel all sorts of different things, in a real positive way. And I know your journey involved a lot of incredible personal challenges that really enriched you and some of your philosophies and your approach to life. So what do you think are some of the things that you reflect on now, and how that's sort of enriched you as a leader and as a clinician and even as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I don't think you don't understand whether you're resilient or not until it's proven, and you either survive or you don't. And I think that the number one thing, through personal and professional and my wife's illness and various other things, the number one thing I realized was there was a significant handful, like a decent handful of people that really cared about me, and they genuine as a human being, as a professional. And so I sort of survived that pretty difficult period because of professional friendships that were genuine friendships, and also people that could see you for who you were and what you could contribute. So I was incredibly grateful to my network. One of my senior surgical colleagues, we played hours and hours and hours of golf, and that was an incredible, I think it was more for my benefit than his, but we both love golf and we love coronary surgery. And I think that got me through a pretty challenging time. And then ultimately, to be honest with you, it was the American experience. And we landed and we were embraced by the Upper Arlington community, which is the suburb, for want of a better term, the county, whatever it was called. That wasn't a county, the suburb, I think it was, that we lived in Columbus, Ohio. And we had an incredible group of friends. Ali got pretty sick pretty quickly, and all these people we didn't know surrounded us with American hospitality. And the sense of community in the United States was extraordinary. And we were, I'm not particularly religious, but the kids have always gone to little Catholic schools, and so they went to the local community Catholic school, and there's a whole community there. And then we had community at the country club, and then we had a community through the university. The Americans embrace, and I think there's something we've got to really change in Australia. They really embrace, if you're good at something, they embrace you. As Australia, they kind of try and pull you down a bit, I think. And I don't know whether that's
Tall
an
poppy
English thing or
syndrome.
whether it's a tall poppy syndrome. But I do think that if we don't celebrate, we celebrate sporting heroes reasonably well until they lose something, and then we get stuck into them. But I think until we celebrate and we promote each other in whatever profession you're in, I think Australia is going to really struggle to compete on this kind of level, like the Americans do, like building these huge institutions that have legacies that go for, not decades, but for centuries. And you've got these hospitals in the middle of nowhere, the Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, the Sinai system, etc. So that was really, really encouraging. And the American system, they see you as a source of revenue for the hospital, whereas in Australia, I think we're seen as a cost centre. So, and I think we probably are because of the way we structure our funding. But yeah, the US system is interesting in the way that they've done that. It's obviously highly resourced. And just the sheer volume. I mean, huge hospitals, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 beds. I mean, the hospital I worked in did 5,000 robotic cases a year. That's just unbelievable. So, that was an extraordinary volume of work. So that was really interesting. It kind of, it allowed me to, the COVID system, because everyone was, buckled up. And so I discovered the joys of audiobooks. So I read audiobook after audiobook after audiobook. So I probably read 150 audiobooks, I think, through the COVID period. And then I did a bunch of business courses and also, really did a deep dive on the finance aspect of things. I did a deep dive on the MedTech side of things. I also used exactly what we're doing, what you and I did, which is saying yes to meeting different people. So I had a lot of just random Zoom calls with the most random people, like finance guys in Australia, finance guys in New York, various MedTech guys from sort of mid-tier companies that may have had nothing to do with what I was interested in, except that they were really interesting people and they were interested in what I was doing. And then I just think that whole connection thing, COVID was bad for a whole lot of reasons, but it was really, really good for breaking down all the barriers around exactly what we're doing now with speaking remotely and speaking like we're sitting in the same room. So I had that 3 or so year period of a lot of personal growth and a lot of personal education, which was as well as operating and looking after sick people and all that stuff. But I read something interesting on LinkedIn this morning about exactly what we're talking about, which is clinicians at sort of my stage, where they've done it for so long that everything's kind of the same. They're having the same clinical problems, the same patient, things to deal with. And that the thing is also you can do the job pretty well now, which is why experience is important. And how important it was to build a portfolio career so you can maintain interest in all aspects of your intellectual curiosity. So I thought that was a pretty poignant thing that I read this morning prior to our conversation today. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, nothing ever changes and you keep doing the same thing over and over again, at worst, you become just on autopilot. Yes, you're going to, get the benefit of mastery in those 10,000 hours, but where's that neuroplasticity? Where's that opportunity to make yourself uncomfortable, to experience something that makes you like stop a bit, have to really think? And I think that's where I say this quote so many times on this show. A girlfriend of mine, she's a coach in tech, and she says, if you're ripe, you're rotting, and if you're green, you're growing. And so it just always reminds me to throw ourselves into uncomfortable situations and creative opportunities, and it could be personally and professionally. But I think it really is what allows you to make those connections. Even like you said, meeting people that, on the front of it, you don't really actually know where that connection's going to go. But then through those conversations, you uncover something that you didn't know, or, another avenue, another network. And then you end up having conversations like this. So when you fast forward to today, because of your willingness to try on those different meetings and those different conversations and even experiences, you've now created such an impressive portfolio career. Working with consultancies, starting a med tech company, starting this asset company. I mean, as we discussed before, I just wonder, let me take a step back first, because I do want to zoom in on Cordis Asset Management. And I'd like us to dive into sort of kind of how that ended up being created, because I know that's something you're really passionate about. And it's probably one of the most divergent areas that you spend your time in day to day. So how did we go from talking to some people in finance, talking to some med tech organizations to founding this asset management company?
A lot of the time is I was pretty unhappy in the situation that I was in my consultant career in Sydney. I just wasn't. I just don't think that I was working in an environment that was suitable for me, and so I was very frustrated. And so I spent a lot of time saying yes to things and meeting different people and doing whatever. And a junior colleague of mine who I actually was going to look after for a PhD, and thankfully we didn't get the funding, and he's now gone on to a huge medtech career in the United States. He's a solid 2 decades younger than me. And I got an email randomly, which was, "Do you want to come to an information, like a question, a survey night around doctors and investing, and there'll be $200 cash." And I said to David Bell, I said, "Oh, well, we should go because we'll get $200." And there was a fantastic French restaurant called Papillon Below. And I said, "We'll go there and we'll have dinner afterwards and we'll talk about all the things that we wanted, like our medtech interests and our business interests." David took it a whole nother level. Anyway, so we went, and the guy that ran it was a fellow called Andrew Inwood, who runs a big data company, and he was doing a PhD in his late 50s. Andrew would be a decade older than me, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He'd be early 60s now, in decision theory, which I thought was fascinating. He's a guy who was and it turned out that he started in medicine and got out after 6 months, and he was also at the residential college that I was at, but then was 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 making whiskey in his room and he wasn't allowed to. So they asked him, but he went next door to St. Paul's College, and it turned out we knew a whole bunch of people in common, and we sort of found each other interesting, I suppose. And it turned out that we lived in the same suburb, and we used to catch up and just have coffee and just talk about stuff. And one thing led to another, and then ultimately he was fascinated by my interest in the wider world. And so we would have it every Monday, but probably every third Monday we'd meet down at the beach down here at Balmoral, and he'd bring different people to me. I met these incredible people, really high Macquarie bankers, high guys in finance, just interesting, smart people right at the top of Magellan, various other things. And then we were looking at building a bespoke. I get very frustrated with financial services for us as customers. I just don't think it's done very well. And I think that people take a lend of doctors as well. And because we're very time poor and we're very trusting. So we're looking at starting a bespoke medical financial services company. And that obviously wasn't sort of going to happen. It was very hard to get traction. But in parallel, my friend Michael Cartmell and I, who I met him when we were doing the MitraClip program with my colleague and good friend Martin Ing when I was at RPA and Macquarie, we were doing MitraClip. And Michael Cartmell was the technical support person for that. And Martin is not so much now, but at that time was pretty chronically late. So often we'd be standing in the hybrid operating theatre for 20, 30 minutes waiting for Martin. And Michael and I developed a pretty interesting friendship. And he's a really fascinating guy, a true polymath, very good with computers and very good with business and all the things that I'm not particularly good with. And we started as a joke looking at the screen, these giant hybrid operating screens, and looking at the x-rays of patients, and we looked at the sequence of their devices that went into these people over time. So you'd see sternal wires from their heart operation from 2005, and then you'd see a pacemaker from 2011, and you'd see the leads that had been removed to have their upgraded pacemaker, and then they'd had a transcatheter aortic valve, and now we're putting, and then we started adding dollar values to each one of those devices. And also we realized that if they didn't have any one of those interventions, they wouldn't have got to live to have the next intervention. So there was a linked process to these. And then we said, oh, well, this is pretty interesting, maybe. And at the time, as I said, I was pretty frustrated. So I flippantly said, oh, well, and I live in Mossman. There's a lot of finance guys. I said, and they seem to have a much better work-life balance than I do. And I thought, well, maybe we should become hedge fund guys. I don't think I ever knew what a hedge fund was. And he obviously knew exactly what I was saying. And then he went away and did the incredibly complex reverse modeling of the economics around the potential investable universe. So we had 1,000 companies that got trimmed out to 100 companies. And then we were just going to do a friends and family investment that we were going to run ourselves. And this is end of 2018, beginning of 2019. So before COVID. And we looked into how all that worked, and we had, because we didn't have access to private markets, we didn't run private markets. We had three things. It had to be a listed company so we could see the finances. It had to have a device that was approved either with TGA, CE, FDA, whatever, and it had to be revenue positive. So the device had to be making, it had to be profitable. So once we trimmed that down, we got down to sort of about 30 odd companies, and then we built a portfolio. And then in passing, I mentioned this idea to my friend Andrew. my core data friend, Andrew, and he went, hang on. And to Andrew's credit, he sat back and he said, tell me more about it. And Andrew's one of the smartest people I know, and he's also incredibly interested in the world. So he's very happy to sit and listen. And then one thing led to another, and suddenly we were off and running with some people I'd met in our breakfast meetings that had come through, and I saw there was a known quantity. And then we just built out this business over the course of time, and then here we are. So yeah, that's how it kind of came about. But it was truly serendipitous, and in some ways at the beginning started off as a little bit of a joke, actually. It was one of those flippant conversations you have in an operating room waiting to start your day's work. So anyway, is what it is.
I had in
Been
my
fun.
head what was the spark, and I think the spark was probably a little bit of discomfort, discontent, as you said, where you know what you were experiencing.
Yeah, I was pretty frustrated with my work environment. I'll be honest with you, and it didn't appear that it was going to ever get any better. So ultimately, I left that work environment, and that was a very hard decision. But it's simply the best decision I've ever made in my life was to go, because it gave me the opportunity to work for Boston Consulting Group, which I truly loved. I thought that was a fantastic how to think, how to analyze a problem, how to look at a problem over a 1, 2, 5, 8, 10-year horizon rather than a 4-hour horizon, which is what I was doing when I was as a surgeon. And I also met a bunch of really, really smart people. I also worked the culture, the way consulting firms treat their teams, and I think medicine's got a lot to learn actually in how other professions look after their junior staff. So I learned a lot from Boston Consulting Group. It was fantastic. I was very grateful for that opportunity. So it's good. And all was happening in parallel. It all happens, and it has to happen in parallel because you don't have enough lifetimes to link all those things in.
Yeah, but you have to
such.
be willing to walk through that door and explore it. If you get uncomfortable and you just go, right, you never actually get to explore the next meeting, the next breakfast.
Well, the other thing too is you got to have a lot of, you might meet someone 5 years ago as well, and then you reconnect with them 5 years later when the opportunity actually is available as opposed to not being available. I mean, I quit my job in Sydney with no particular thought, and I had, I was in my late 40s and had 3 kids and a mortgage. I had no idea what I was going to do. All I knew was I had to go and do something else. And it was, that initial elation of thank God I'm out of there. And then the next thing was, well, what do I do now? And then ultimately, it was another serendipitous thing. I went to a meeting I like coronary surgery. So I was in New York at the International Coronary Congress, which they held in Manhattan every second year in winter. And we were having a dinner, and you can't make this stuff up. So we're having dinner at the Harvard Club in New York. And I sat next to an Italian guy who had given some talks, and the two of us knew no one. Like, he'd just been to New York, and it turns out we both had done fairly similar things, which is left jobs we were pretty unhappy with. And one thing led to another, and it turned out to be Mario Gardena, who's arguably the most prolific and best academic coronary surgeon in the world, and we became fast friends. And through his network and his generosity and his mentorship and friendship, one thing led to another. I met all these other interesting people, and then I was in Singapore, same thing. Mario came to Sydney, and we asked him and his wife for dinner, and there was another guy who was on a boat with him at lunch. We said, what are you doing tonight? Oh, we're going to Michael. So we invited him as well. And that was Theo Kofidis, who's one of the most famous minimally invasive. So he came out to dinner at our place, and we had a great time. And then a year later, we're in Japan teaching coronaries, and some Yamazaki 18-year-old whiskey probably was involved as well. And we discussed we had to do some work together, and he organized through his energy. He's got incredible energy. In fact, I'll set you up with Theo and you interview him on your podcast, but he's got a much more impressive medtech career than I do. I went operating in Singapore for a week, so I did a lot of off-pump operations, and then the Medtronic Advisory Board was at the same time, and it was exactly a year to the day that I left my job in Sydney. I thought, well, there's got to be more to life than this. And so I made one phone call, and then that was on the Saturday, and then on the Tuesday I had a job offer at Ohio State, and off I went. So it was a product of these individuals that I'd met on this sort of weird global journey, and also having interest in people. Mario and I drank a bottle of wine, and we talked about life, and we laughed, and we spent a lot of time together, and then we had conversations afterwards. We started writing some papers together. He came out as a guest professor to a really good meeting that happens in Sydney every second year. And then one thing led to another, and ultimately those relationships is what takes you through to your next journey. So, and the other thing too is you don't have to stay. It's not compulsory to stay in something that's miserable. It's just not. So it is not compulsory to be miserable at work. And I was at that point where I just was hating hating my work environment. And I love my work. I've always loved my work, but I was really hating the environment that I was in, and something had to give. And the environment was never going to change because the institution is always bigger than the individual. So, I had to put on my little backpack and go on my way. So, which was a cool journey.
Well, and it sounded like it was exactly, what was in your
Mm.
destiny. And,
Mm.
I think that we don't go anywhere alone. We don't achieve anything alone. And we have a saying that it takes a village, just like it takes a village to raise a child. I think it takes a village for us to find where we're meant to be, where we're meant to serve. And it certainly sounds like through your openness and your willingness to meet with people, not knowing where it might lead, is what eventually kind of created this beautiful constellation of connections, which then, opened doors for
Exactly.
you.
Asking for help is okay too. Asking. I mean, Steve Jobs is amazing. They get their snippets. LinkedIn, such a wonderful. You and I wouldn't have met without LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's fantastic.
Yeah.
And he talks these little snippets he talks about, and he said whenever he's ever asked to help, people have always helped him. And whenever people ask him for help, he's always tried to help them. And I think that's part of being a human being is even if you can't help someone, saying, look, thank you for connecting with me, but I can't help you at this point, but maybe you should talk to this person. And I've just had so much help from various people over the years. There's been a fair share of obstacles thrown in my way as well, which I must confess, as I've got older, I can see those obstacles coming a little bit further away. And I think you also end up coalescing with people that are like-minded as well. I think you end up working with the people you seek out people who are like-minded, and you end up hanging out with them, spending more time as you get older, people that are that 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 enrich you and don't suck your energy, they give you energy. So yeah, I think it's important. That's really important to recognize
Yeah. Yeah.
the
What I
environment
have,
you're in.
yes. And what I was having in my head, as you said, you seek those people out that are like-minded. I think that what ends up happening is we get clearer on what we value in ourselves and in others. And then as you become really clear on those values, you are just instantly, magnetic to people that share those and vice versa, which I think then makes the experience just very, very rich, because you guys are sort of operating on that similar mindset. You can appreciate lots of different and dynamic topics and things, industries and
Yeah, I
ideas.
think also you need to get outside of your own. The thing that really changed my view, I read Ray Dalio's book, Principles, and I
Mhm.
read that at the time that I was leaving this particular, and every single thing in the book that he said that was a good workplace, the workplace I was in had none of them, or the opposite. And
Yeah.
and he also, and I thought that was a really interesting thing. And I mean, he's the most successful hedge fund guy in the world. I think he's also incredibly methodical in how he goes about making his decisions and building teams. I'm sure he's ruthless. In fact, I've read the counter story for Ray, but you don't become that successful unless you're a little bit ruthless. And I'm loving his later books on the world economies and empires and various other things. But the number one thing that really came from him was two things. One is radical transparency in institutions. So I
Amen.
think one thing we need to have is you've got to be super honest,
Yeah.
and you need to reward people for honesty, because if you don't get genuine feedback, then nothing works. And the other thing he said was that the only thing that matters in life is your relationships with people. And I thought that was a really important point. And he's obviously gone on to be a huge mentor and champion for people, and has become a global citizen and incredibly driven in his senior years to relay information and to make people better. So his book was very transformative. If someone said to me, if you could only read one book, what would that book be? It would be Ray Dalio's Principles. I think healthcare needs to read that book very much. But I thought the healthcare, we struggle a little bit because it's grown in a different silo. It's not a business. Healthcare is not a business. It's a business to a certain extent in the United States, but then you've got a business people managing healthcare people. And I do think that we lack training and we lack mentorship and we lack expertise. And they'll often promote the wrong people into leadership positions as well, who have no leadership talent, and all they're doing is hanging on to their position because they want that position. So that's really, really interesting to see when you see in the business circles, if people aren't performing, they just get fired. And that's refreshing. It's not refreshing for them, but it's refreshing that if someone's not doing their job properly, then they get removed. And that's obviously very difficult in the healthcare setting. But certainly the intellectual journey. And the other thing too is all this stuff's very, very cheap. You can read all these books, and Patrick Lencioni's stuff, Simon Sinek's stuff was amazing. I loved his stuff. And if you want to, with a lot of these books, the author reads the book to you. So for $20, you get 7 or 8 hours of someone talking to you. And that's what I found incredible with the benefit of COVID, is that you weren't allowed to talk to anyone. And so I'd walk around the hospital with these little fellas in, just educating myself and having these incredible, monologues from these incredible people. And it was transformative for me. It really changed the way I thought about things, and then sent me on different journeys with, the heart valve company and various other projects that I've been involved with since I've come back to Sydney. And so that's been a really good. I think you got to shake it up. I shook it up pretty hard, I'll be honest with you. Looking back at it now, I was bordering on reckless. As I said, I made a decision one particular day that I'm done here, and I quit, and that was it. I had no plan. I had no idea what was going to happen. And then, a whole lot of, some good things, but mostly a whole lot of bad things happened. And then, and ultimately it was the liberation of, getting on American Airlines and just going and landing, and then off we went, and hiking in the American wilderness, and, learning all about, I read a book on the frontier, Davy Crockett and Tecumseh and all these people, all the people that built the world that I lived in, and all the forests and the rivers and the animals and all that stuff. I mean, I would never have done that if I hadn't have, I would
No,
have only
you
understood
needed to shake
kookaburras.
it up. That was
Yeah, and it was
exactly what
cool.
you
It
need.
was
Whether
cool.
you knew it or
It was
not,
cool.
it was what was required. And the shake-up gave you the reset. And then it sounds like in the time that you had, you used it really well. The more you reflect
Yeah.
and the more
Thank
you
you.
go
Thank you. Yeah.
inside, the more I think a big part of why we're on this earth is to learn more about ourselves and get really clear, whether it's Ray Dalio's principles, whether you call it values. I think being able to really know what makes you tick, and how do you know? But you have to explore. Yep. You have to go out there into the unknown and just
You
give it a
don't know.
go,
You
try it
don't know.
on.
Human beings need friction, and human beings need resistance to improve. And you also have to have a reason as well. Sometimes it's
Yeah,
just
sometimes we need
pure
the shove,
intellectual
huh?
curiosity. Yeah,
We
you
need
do
the
need a
boot.
shove. And but I do recommend, the other thing too is I don't think, as doctors, you're sort of very institutionalized. So we study hard at school, university, and then I did, PhDs, and a lot of surgical training is, I went to Canberra, Dubbo, Brisbane, London, and so you're in this kind of weird, so you don't really grow up until you're probably in your 40s. And then you actually have to think, well, what do I want to do now? And so it's very hard sometimes to lay out a path for what you want to do. And ultimately, I say to the junior guys, you've got to work backwards. I'm a terrible golfer, but I do like golf. So you've got to imagine that you're standing on a green rather than on a tee. So you're actually looking back about where you need to be. And that's very hard, because you can go, well, I'll do this and I'll do that and I'll do whatever. But if you don't, and I always say that 45 is the magic age, and you have to think about it. When you're 23, it's really hard to imagine what it's like to be 45, but you're 45 pretty quickly. And so that's the thing you do. I do say to them, I said, the other thing is you've got to do a job that you enjoy. You've also got to do a job that well, there's three things I say. Is one is you've got to enjoy something, and the best list to write is the things you don't want to do. So you start crossing things off you don't want to do, and then you have to
100%.
work out how much money you think you want or you need. And there's very different remunerations across the medical spectrum. And the other thing is lifestyle. Do you want to be in the hospital in the middle of the night? Do you want to be working all weekend, or do you want to work 9 till 4, 3 days a week, whatever it is? And so you have to think about all these things, because no one tells you any of this stuff when you're doing medical training. They'll
Can.
get up and say, well, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, who can tell you that either? Those answers. You've got to ask yourself those questions.
Yeah, but no, they don't even tell you to ask the questions. And no one ever told me to ask those questions. Everyone just gets up and says, oh, well, I do orthopedics. It's great. Come and we'll talk about it. As opposed to, well, do you really want to do orthopedics? Or I'm doing neurosurgery, or I want to do dermatology, or I want to do, whatever. So I do think that part of I think we'd have a lot happier medical workforce if we created some mentorship around career choices and what that actually means, and what are the
Yeah.
implications for that. Because there's a lot of burnout in the junior workforce. I can see it. And there's also a generational change. I just don't want to work as to the hours that we were working. And so we're going to have a workforce crisis going forward of how do we get people to do the things that are hard. So it's going to be
Yeah.
difficult.
But you
But
know
we
what
have
you
to move
just,
to them. We have to
yeah.
make the workforce like that.
Well, and is it moving to them, or is it, I mean, I think, obviously I'm a huge fan of mentorship and sharing knowledge and experiences, but I think that by having someone who can help hold that mirror up to you and help support you with some of that curiosity and those questions. The quality of your life is defined by the quality of the questions that you ask yourself. And so even just a prompt, you can't provide the answers, but explaining to them about, the different lifestyles, as you said, and be clear on what you value and what you enjoy. And also be willing that if you do go down a certain path and it doesn't, it's not the right fit for you, don't be afraid to make a change. I think that what we see now is this growing audience of medical doctors who, they're stuck between the golden handcuffs of their salary, but wanting to explore something else, or the idea they've invested all this time in learning this particular specialty, and can I move away from it? So I actually think that they could have the best of both worlds, and they could, continue to practice, but maybe less of their time, and then move into that other sort of calling that they're experiencing or they're interested in. But what advice do you have for those doctors that might be thinking about doing something like this? Where would the first step look like? Would it be that reflective inquiring, or?
I think you've got to give yourself time and space to think about these things. And I discovered the joys of getting up super early 5 or 6 years ago, at least a few mornings a week, and just going wandering. I did that in the very cold winters of Columbus, Ohio. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I became friends with the resident skunk and the deer and the squirrels and all that sort of stuff. And that was really useful because the skunk was hilarious. I didn't realize how little they were. They're really little things. But anyway, so I discovered, and that was fantastic. And we lived in a very safe neighborhood, and there was enough. And I did that, and that was very transformative. And I realized that as a doctor, and a parent and a spouse, the only time you have is really early in the morning. So, and the 5 a.m. club, I think, is too extreme for me, but I think there's elements of truth in that. So even if you do it a couple of mornings a week and just get up, and there's a lot to be said for just thinking about stuff, and then you actually have to work out the things that you're happy, the things you're not happy with, and where you want to get to. So there's a concept of goal. I always had goals, but I don't think I ever really had a plan until more recently. So I think you have to have a plan, and a plan has to be realistic. And you have to bounce those ideas off people. Dalio talks about it, believable people. And a believable person is someone that's done it. It's not someone who, you don't take financial advice off your parents who haven't done it, for example. So you need to go, like the Rich Dad Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki's book's very telling, where he went and got financial advice from his rich dad, which wasn't his real dad. So I think you need to go and do that. And then I think you need to seek out other opportunities and try things. And people are going to say no a lot. People are going to look at you like you're funny. But ultimately, you'll find an opportunity. And when you're given that opportunity, you need to grab it with both hands. One of the things about medicine is, and I've thought about this, is that your identity and your genuine economic moat, the economic moat that sits around, and Warren Buffett talks about that a lot. Your economic moat is the fact you're a doctor and you're a practicing clinician. So you need to have something absolutely ironclad if you're going to give up being a clinical practitioner if you don't have something completely sorted out. So you have to accept you are still going to be a clinical doctor. And obviously that goes up and down, and it's how busy it is, and it also goes up and down depending on what type of doctor you are. But you've also got to make sure you don't drop the clinical ball. You've still got to maintain exceptionally high clinical standards through this process. And I also find that the more relaxed and the more broad your world is, I think you become a better doctor because you become a better human being. So you can interact with your patients better, you enjoy your patients more, you can interact with your team more. And certainly, people talk about surgeons, but surgery is the ultimate team sport. I can't do what I do without the 8 people in the room and the people on the ward and intensive care and my fabulous secretaries and all the different people that make so that we can do safe surgery. So that's number one, is you've got to make sure that you hang on to your clinical stuff and do it properly. And then ultimately you need help because you can't do it on your own. So you need to build a team and you need to be loyal to that team. And loyalty goes downwards, not upwards. So if you're the leader, then your job is to be loyal to the people that report to you. And Simon Sinek talks about that a lot in his servant leadership book. I think that's really, really important. And then you got to do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah.
And get on with it. And the other thing is you're going to fail a bit. I started a whole bunch of different crazy businesses. Doctor's property business. I had a little consulting business. We're doing bits and bobs here and there, and sort of nothing. I learned a lot, but ultimately they were failures. But you learn to fail, and you also can recognize if that's starting to happen again, so you can pivot and change. And you also have to not be embarrassed about that either. You're always going to learn something, as long as you don't hurt people, rip people off, or be disingenuous. I think the reality is that you can try all sorts of different things. And I also learn a lot just by saying yes to board positions, advisory board positions, saying yes to proctoring. I did a lot of proctoring. So I dealt with a lot of overseas doctors and a lot of new technology and a lot of first-in-man type things, which is really interesting. And also saying yes to people wanting to come and work with you. So you can always find a place for someone in your, when I had my bigger research program, you'd always find a place for someone. There was always things for people to do. And then obviously then they'd grow up and then you'd be part of their network. And so then they'd be helping you in your journey as well. So that's really what it comes down to, is you've got to be prepared to spend a lot of time. At the time, sometimes you think, my wife thinks, what are you having another useless meeting? And as it's turned out, she's realized what I've been up to is that it's taken 20 years to build a network, maybe 15 years to build a network like this. And now she kind of accepts it. But yeah, no, I think that's the most important thing. And the other thing too is you've got to stay intellectually curious. I think curious people are more interesting. And there's going to always be a better way of doing something. And you can usually go and find that. And if there's not a better way of doing it, then you've got to work out a better way of doing it. Yeah, that's.
Well, I think it starts
It
with
is what
that
it is.
curiosity. You said, so curiosity, thinking, finding time to think, finding time to reflect, asking those questions, that network of believable people or of just people to start with. And then you start to realize, who are the ones that you really lean into. And then you start to cultivate your own board, your own village, being willing to fail up. I never even knew that there were other businesses prior to this, but of course there were. It would make perfect sense that there were. No one sort of, gets the unicorn first out of the gate, even if it's some other thing that you've tried on before. Saying yes to proctoring, saying yes to sharing your knowledge and learning how to lead. I think those are all really amazing tips and tricks for people that are just thinking, what are the skills? What are the experiences that I need that if I want to try to make this shift successful? I think, that's 5 or 6 items right there that could, just start kind of illuminating what else could be outside of the traditional career.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I also think that you'll never regret a coffee meeting with someone, ever. And obviously that's turned into virtual meetings a little bit more, and that makes it even easier. But you'll always, and as I said, those people will reappear often because our universe is quite small.
Yeah.
Whether you like them in Australia, it's ridiculously small, but even on a global level, it's very, very small. And there's only so many cardiovascular medical device companies. There's only so many, global, cardiac surgeons and what have you. And there's only so many people that have the energy to, all the craziness, I suppose, to go off and do all the sort of different things that I've done. But I certainly look back, and when you're sitting in your rocking chair and you're whatever, and, hopefully grandkids and stuff running around, it's the people that you've met and the places that you've been and the things that you've done. And my main surgical mentor, funnily enough, was another North Shore surgeon, Peter Brady. And he sort of reminded me a lot of a football coach. And he flogged you really hard because he wanted you to succeed. And he'd hang you out in doing difficult operations, and then he'd always appear right at the right time and kind of help you when you're training and stuff. And I remember talking to him, and it was the most poignant thing. And I was doing my last operation at North Shore before I went to England to do my fellowship. So I did a 6-month period when we got married and did a few other things. And we did a whole operation from skin to skin. And I said to him, we haven't talked about this operation at all. We talked about, what I was doing in life. And we both love cattle. So we're talking about his cows on his farm and various other things. And I said to him, it must be incredible to have taken someone. I was pretty green when I came 4 years before to now this. And he said, look, Mike, it's the only thing that matters. He said, I can do 10,000 operations in my career. And he said, but what matters is I train you so you can do 10,000 operations. And he said, and I train the other 20 people so they can do 10,000 operations. And each one of those people will train 20 people to do 10,000 operations. He said, that's all that matters. And he said, it's a privilege and an honor to see how you've come and where you've developed. And he's still my mentor. If I have any career or whatever, I ring Peter and say, can we have a beer? And we go have a beer and we talk about stuff. And I think that's true. That's what mentorship is that the game is bigger than the individual. And I think, unfortunately, in Australia, that's a little bit rare because of the way our system structured with fee-for-service and individual practitioners and all that sort of stuff. I think it makes it very, very hard to build big American units where we're all salaried and we all work together and it was all very straightforward. So that's a really poignant thing for me, is that your job is to train the next group of people and to make them better than you, really. And you've got to choose people that are better than you to do that, to go through that journey.
You said it really well. The game is bigger than just ourselves. And what a fantastic way to wrap up this amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate you sharing your
No, it's my
story
pleasure. My
and your
pleasure.
wisdom and your candor. It's such a privilege to have you on the show, and I know that everyone who listens to this is going to be really grateful as well. So everyone, please don't forget to like and share this episode with hashtag medtechmentorpodcast. And if you'd like to be in the running to have some time with Michael himself in a one-on-one mentoring session, I can promise you, you will absolutely never forget it. And thank you all for listening. Remember, wherever you go, please leave it better than you found it.
I like that. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you.